So we talked about sinusoidal functions, specifically sine and cosine, what their basic graphs look like, as well as we've done transformations. We looked at what stretches look like. We looked at what reflections or flips look like. And of course, the one we have to add are shifts. But basically, okay, transformations of sine and cosine follow the same equation as we've been doing since the beginning of the year, where we use the letters A, B, H, and K to represent the different transformations. Okay, but instead of like F or G, we put sine or cos. Okay? So here's what all these things represent. When we go through an equation, we're asked to graph one of these. Okay? The period is represented by B, but we calculate it by doing 2 pi over the absolute value, don't include the negative, whatever B is. Because remember, the transformation for a horizontal stretch from B is 1 over B. But a period for regular sine and cosine is 2 pi. The amplitude will be whatever the value of A is. The midline will be whatever the value of K is. Because remember, K represents a vertical shift. So remember in the regular sine and cosine graph, it was the x-axis or the theta axis. Well, if there's a number at the end, the midline moves up, so do the max and min lines. Okay, so that's a vertical shift. To find the minimum value, we take whatever the value of K is, and we subtract the amplitude without the negative. So like if the amplitude was 5 and the midline was 10, we would go 10 minus 5. Okay? To find the maximum, we take whatever the midline is, and we add the amplitude without the negative. And then the horizontal shift, which with sinusoidal functions, another phrase is phase shift. That's represented by H, and it follows the same rules. Like if it's in minus form, it's moving to the right. If it's in plus form, it's moving to the left. Okay, I apologize in advance, but I'm going to make this next thing a little messy because I don't like the order that this is in, and I changed the order. So, what we want to do first, so replace number 2 with number 1. This is going to be the first one we're going to do. We're going to locate the midline of the graph first. So we're going to work on K first by drawing a dotted line at whatever y equals K is. Remember, y equals K represents horizontal line. That's the midline. That's the first thing we're going to do. The second thing we're going to do is actually number 3. Change that to number 2. We're going to use the amplitude to draw dotted lines at the minimum, or sorry, I'll keep it in the maximum and minimum. And remember, we find those by taking the midline plus the amplitude, the midline minus the amplitude. Then we're going to go back up here, number 3, take out always, scratch that out. we're going to find the period. And then we're going to come down to number 4, and we're going to label the x-axis using period. And remember, when we were labeling, or when we were drawing basic sine and cosine graphs, we always did 4 ticks, 4 notches, okay? Because basically, one cycle of sine and cosine is made up of 4 points. The 5th point, it returns to its starting point. Okay? The value of the period, whatever the period is, goes on the 4th tick, or 4th notch. We're going to draw the graph then. I know we haven't addressed any flips or shifts yet. So we're going to kind of do this in steps, because trying to do it all together can be very confusing. So we're going to do all of this, and then we're going to do like a dotted line sketch of the curve. And then, if there is any flip, in other words, if A is negative, so we're going to kind of put this down here in step number 5. If A is negative, we're going to flip it. And if it shifts, we're going to shift it. We'll do those at the end. So basically what we're working on is KABH in that order. This will make sense once we start doing some examples. Now remember, when you sketch, you always start from the y-axis. Your sketch, your cycle. If it's a cos curve, okay, if it's positive, it's going to look like that. If it's negative, it's going to be flipped. The sine curve, if it's positive, it's going to start like that and end like that. But if it's negative, it's going to flip. I know that's a lot to keep in mind, but once you start doing a few of these, you'll get it. Okay, let's look at our first one to graph. And I'm going to do this, like I said, I'm going to do this slightly different order. I'm going to do midline, amplitude, this. So when I look at this, I see a value for A, which is going to affect the amplitude. And I see a value for B, which is going to affect the period. There's no value for H, which means it doesn't shift. There's no value for K, or the value for K is technically 0, because this would be the same as plus 0. So K is 0, it stays on the x-axis. So the midline, which I'm going to go to first, is y equals 0. And I'm going to do a dashed line there. So I've got the line where it splits it in half for us. The amplitude, A, is 1/2. That means from the midline, I'm going to go down 1/2 to get the minimum, and I'm going to go up 1/2 to get the maximum. So the minimum is going to be 0 minus 1/2. This is already positive, I don't have to negative, which is negative 1/2. The maximum is going to be 0 plus, or 1/2. So I can just go like this, just as long as I label it 1/2. I don't have to label any other notches along the vertical axis. And then I can go down here -1. And then I sketch 2 horizontal dashed lines here. Like so. So it's sine that I'm graphing. So my sine curve is going to be within here. Okay? I'm just not quite sure where I started yet and where I finish a cycle. That's where I go to the period. Well, the period is going to be 2 pi over the value of b, which is 4. Or in other words, pi over 2. Or a half pi. So it's really compressing it. It's stretching it in horizontally. So do your 4 notches. 1, 2, 3, 4. And this one, the 4th notch, or 10. It's pi over 2. Because there's no flipping, because there's no shifting, I'm ready to sketch my final. So, remember with the sine curve, positive, it's going to look like this. So on the y-axis, I start at the intersection of the y-axis and the midline. Then I go up, back to the middle, down, back to the middle. So the next notch I go up, the max. Next notch I go back to the midline. Next notch I go down to the min. And last notch, I go back to the midline, which completes the cycle. And then sketch your curve. And don't forget to put arrows on the end. Like so. And you've got it. So it's quite a few steps, but if you keep everything organized and do everything in order, right, you'll be able to sketch these. And often a question you will get, you will see, is you'll be given an equation and you'll be asked to sketch at least one period of this graph. Well, we did. Okay. Sometimes you may be asked to restrict your domain, but we'll talk about that later. Okay. Next one. We've got a cosine graph. We've got a value for p. Which is pi. We've got a value for k. A, well, what number goes in front of cos? It's 1, so the amplitude is going to be 1. And there's no shift, so there's no h. Sorry, I should have said that on the previous page. Under shift, I should have put no shift. Do that back here. And there's no flip. Because there's no negatives in front of A or B. So that's good. I can just get all my information and then sketch the final graph. All right, let's go to the midline first. What's the midline? The midline is the value of K. the midline, we're going to move it up to y equals 2. So here's our midline. So this is 2. This is 1. Now we go to the amplitude. Well, A is 1. And we use these two to find the minimum and max. The minimum will be the midline minus the amplitude, which is 1. The maximum will be the midline plus the amplitude, which is 3. Well, I've already got 1 here, so I can put my minimum line. And then the maximum line is another notch up at 3. So my coast graph is going to go in there. Question is, how does it look? Well, there's no shifting or flipping, but there is a stretch. So we got to find that by the period 2 pi by whatever the value of b is, which in this case is pi. So the period is just going to be the number 2. So we put our 4 notches, it ticks, and you put the value 2 at the 4th one. We don't necessarily have to fill these in. The only time we're going to have to know these is if we do any shifting. Okay, so we're ready to graph. Remember, cosine starts up high and goes like this. So that means it starts at the max on the y-axis. Starts up here. Next notch, it goes to the midline. Next notch, it goes to the minimum. Next notch, it comes back to the midline. And the final notch, it goes back to its starting point. And then draw your curve. Remember, don't do this. That's going to be a communication error because it doesn't go past. Okay? Make sure you draw your curve back in. Okay, let's start throwing some shifts and flips in. This one. We've got a value for A. Got a value for H. K is nothing, and B is 1. Okay? Remember, if you don't see a number in front, A is 1. If you don't see a number in front, B is 1. If you don't see a number here, the shift is 0, horizontal. If you don't see a number here, the midline is 0. So for the midline, y is equal to 0. Doesn't move. It's at its origin, which is the x-axis. So there's our midline. Our amplitude is 2. we take the midline and the amplitude to find the max and min. So the min is going to be the midline 0 minus the amplitude, which is -2. And the max is going to be the midline plus the amplitude, which is going to be +2. So I'm going to put 2 up here. I'm going to put -2 down here. And I'm going to draw 2 dotted horizontal lines. Dash. So we know our graph's going to go inside there. We're kind of halfway there. 4 notches to get ready for the period. And the period, remember, is 2 pi over the value of d. So it's going to be 2 pi over 1. So the period doesn't change, it's still at 2 pi. So that's 2 pi. Now remember there's a phase shift, it's going to shift, but what I want to do is I want to draw what it looks like without the phase shift first. So I'm not going to draw a solid curve, I'm going to draw a dashed curve. So remember we've got sine, which looks like this. So I'm going to start here, midline and the y-axis. First notch to the max, second notch back to the mid, third notch to the min, and fourth notch back to the mid. And without the phase shift or horizontal shift, it's going to look like that. But that's not the final answer. So just keep in mind, this is without the shift. The shift tells me I got to go left a quarter pi. Left a quarter pi, or pi over 4. The question is now, how much is that? Like, is it 1 notch? Is it 2 notches? Is it less than a notch? How do I figure this out? Well, let's look at the value of the notches. We need to figure these out. Well, if this is 2 pi, what must this one be? 1 pi. And if this is 1 pi, how much must this one be? Sorry? Pi over 2, half a pi. So what that means is every notch in this one is half a pi. but I only want to shift it a quarter. So doesn't that mean I have to shift it half a notch? Because a quarter will be half a full notch. So I'm going to take every point and shift it to the left a quarter pi. So I'm going to have to add another notch here. And I'm going to take every one, so this one goes over half a notch. This one goes over half a notch. This one, same thing. This one, same thing. This one, same thing. Remember, don't assume one notch is always just one. Sometimes that mistake, students make that mistake. Now we're ready to draw the final. So now I can do a solid curve. Okay, next one, we're getting a little bit more complicated. Okay, though, the stages. So we got lots of stuff going on here. We've got a value of A is 2. We've got a value of B, which is pi over 2. We've got a value of H, which is -1. It tells me I'm going to shift it 1 unit to the right. I don't know how many notches that is yet. And we've got a midline of 1. So everything's represented. Besides 0 or 1. Okay, so mid. Sorry. Y equals 1. Amplitude is 2, which means what's the min? Be careful. -1, because it's 1 minus 2. It's the midline minus the amplitude. And the max is the midline 1 plus the amplitude, which is 3. So now we can sketch all those. So we've got 1. I got to go up 3 notches here. I got to go down to at least -1. So my midline is 1. Just here. My minimum is down at -1. Which is here. My maximum is up at 3. It's here. And my curve's going to be in there. But I got to figure out the period, and then I got to account for the shift. How do I find the period? 2 pi divided by whatever the value of B is. This is not working. There we go. So the period is 2 pi divided by pi over 2, which remember is the same as 2 pi times 2 over pi. The 2 pi sinus 2 pi over 1, so I can reduce the pi's and be left with 2 times 2. Which gives me 4. 1, 2, 3, and this happens to be 4. So it's this one pretty straightforward to figure out the other notches. Okay. Okay, we're not going to do the shift just yet. So we're going to sketch the graph with out the phase shift, which means we're going to do a dash curve. And it's sine, so I start at the midline in the y-axis. Max, mid, min, mid. It's going to look like this. I'm not even going to worry about arrows for this because it's not the final answer. But I have to shift it 1 to the right. So shift 1. Question is, how much is 1? 1 notch, right? Because if you think about it, well, this one has to be 2. This one has to be 4. This one has to be 3. So every notch is worth 1. So 1 to the right, I got to take all those points and move them 1 notch to the right. So I just got to make an extra notch here for this one. So this shifts 1 to the right, 1 notch to the right, 1 notch to the right, 1 notch to the right, notch to the right. And I can draw a smooth curve now because it's my final answer. Yeah.
So do you want us like to show like a donut for and then like solve that? Okay, just
Right to the final answer? You can if you want, but I just caution you that that can get confusing when you're trying to do too many things at one time. That's all. Yeah. In this case, it's probably obvious to see. So yes, so I mean, if you can see, oh yeah, well, I just got to move everything 1 to the right, you're fine. Okay. This one, final one. We got a negative, which means we're going to have to flip. We don't have a value for h though, so we don't have to worry about shifting. So what I would like you guys to do is get all the way up to the period. Figure out the midline, amplitude, max, min, period, put your notches in. And you're pretty much, you're like 80% done. Midline, negative 2. N equals negative 2, which means y equals negative 2. Amplitude, half. negative a half. The negative is the flip, it's something else, where we take absolute value. The minimum. -2 minus a half. So really that's just, you could just say -2.5 or -2.5. You can go to the decimal if you want. Max is -2 plus a half. Would be -1.5 and 1.5. By divide 1/3. Sorry. Oh, it is 1/3. That was 5/3. Which is divide 6/5. Good. Okay, and let's see what that looks like without the vertical flip. So we've got -2. We've got this is -3, this is going to be -2.5. And if this is -1, this is going to be -1.5. So we've got a pretty tight window here. There's the max. There's the mid. And period. 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's 6/5. No shifting, so I don't have to worry about finding the value of the other knotless. Okay. Regular cosine, and remember this is dashed because it's not our final. So we start at the maximum and the y-axis, then we go to mid, 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 max. I don't. Arrows. So that's everything without the flip. So the last thing, because A is negative, you don't flip over the x-axis, you flip over the midline. You got to pretend sort of that's the new x-axis, the midline. So you got to take every point, and if it's at the max, it goes to the min. If it's on the mid, it stays. So this goes down here, this stays, this goes up here, this stays, this goes down here. I mean, again, if you can do that all in one shot, okay, but just be careful. And it's going to look like that. Ooh. Okay,